Great. So as much as this presentation is titled The Kenyan Experience, I'll also give a bit of context to some of our neighbors here in East Africa, and some examples that will stretch to West Africa as well. But even as we talk about the future of democracy, I think it would be good to lay that context from where we are coming from, the interaction with European colonial history in Africa, and how that has influenced or continues to shape the future of democracy, not just in Kenya, but also in the region, because Kenya becoming a protectorate of the British in towards the end of the 1800s and later a colony was something that was not, native communities here in Kenya were given much of a choice. And even the establishment of the legal framework that governed the colonial establishment was set the stage for the future of imperial autocracy and the lack of democratic space, not just here in Kenya, but across Africa colonies. And even after, through agitation by native African communities, especially here in Kenya, calling for more representation, this was not equitable distributed, because you'd find that during the colonial time, there was a minority white rule that excluded the native communities. And this permeated not just across the political space, but even in the economic space, where laws were made to exclude native communities from mainstream economic participation of their countries. And even when after 70 years of colonialism, the European powers decided through a combination of factors to allow African countries like my country of Kenya to have a majority black rule. That was still not done within, what we would call, normal democratic principles, within the confines of democratic principles. And colonial masters, like in this case, the British colonial masters, also had a hand in determining which section of the society will continue after colonialism, and therefore you would find a lot of interference with campaigns and party politics, some of them sponsored by the British colonial rulers, in order to determine which party is going to govern after independence. And therefore, these are things that have continued to shape how democracy evolves in Africa. If you look at the Kenyan example, soon after independence, we went into a de facto one-party state, a model that was followed by many other African countries. Our neighbors in Tanzania had Julius Nyerere, and also other countries such as Malawi under Hastings Kamuzu Banda, who declared a one-party state, denied political pluralism in those countries. All this was inspired by the imperial autocracy that was established under colonial rule. In the case of Kenya, between 1978 and 2002, Kenya was under partly under one-party rule under former President Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi, and who ruled under a one-party state for almost 10 years until the wave of political pluralism, which was inspired partly because of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the former USSR, and with a lot of inspiration from Western Europe and to a large extent the United States, to introduce the Bretton Woods institutions, impressing upon African leaders to allow political pluralism. But even then, a lot of interference coming from the West, and encouraging African autocratic leaders to continue stifling the democratic space. So you find that as much as there was political pluralism encouraged and starting to creep in towards the end of the 1980s and early 1990s, the democratic space was still very squeezed in my country and other countries in the region. All this while, some other countries had got the way of coup d'etats, partly because of lack of this democratic space. I may give the example of Uganda under Dr. Apollo Milton Obote, who was deposed by Idi Amin in the 1970s. Again, because of lack of political pluralism. But this has evolved over time. And like I have said, through the inspiration of World Bank and IMF, calling for political pluralism as part of the structural adjustment plans, and this did help to reintroduce political pluralism. But we have seen cases of voter bribery. We have seen cases of using foreign mercenaries, and this predates Cambridge Analytica. I know Cambridge Analytica has received a lot of coverage, a lot of media attention, but the use of political mercenaries, foreign mercenaries, did not start with Cambridge Analytica. Indeed, it started, with the introduction of multi-party elections, with incumbents coming from one-party rule, wanting to continue with the autocratic rules and seeking for foreign help. So we have seen consultants coming from Germany, consultants coming from the former Yugoslavia, consultants coming from the US as early as the 1990s to come and assist incumbents to win elections. In 2002, Kenya held what would be hailed as one of the most open and most democratic election, where Independence Party KANU and the autocracy of one-party rule that was established soon after independence came to an end through free and fair election. However, it was during this time that technological advancements were happening, opening up of airwaves, and by the time that Kenya was having the 2007 elections, the airwaves, radio stations, and independent media was used to cause division and to cause hate campaigns that ended the country to almost to the brink of a civil war. And this is the precursor of the kind of vitriol or the kind of poisoning that we see in social media. Started with the opening of the airwaves, radio stations that are privately owned and used by politicians to engage the electorate. And it is at this point that, due to the misuse of media, radio stations and private TV stations, that we saw over 500,000 Kenyans, internally displaced, and more than 1,500 Kenyans actually being killed in post-election violence chaos that was experienced in 2007 after disputed elections. That in an environment of poisoned space through the misuse of media. Enter 2013, and this is what we call the age of Cambridge Analytica. And at that point, former President Moi Kibaki had exhausted his constitutional 2-year terms, and the current incumbent, was assisted by Cambridge Analytica to win those elections. But we look at Cambridge Analytica because of the activities of Cambridge Analytica in other countries, the role of Cambridge Analytica in Brexit, the role of Cambridge Analytica in the Trump campaigns. But this is not a space for not a preserve for Cambridge Analytica, because as much as current incumbent president won with the assistance of Cambridge Analytica in 2013 during his first term to run for office, the challenger also had foreign consultants. Maybe their finance or the technological support may not have been as advanced as that of Cambridge Analytica, but indeed, both sides of the political divide did use foreign assistance from experts and mercenaries in those elections. So I think I don't want to belabor the role of Cambridge Analytica. I think BBC, CNN, and all other mainstream media have covered the activities of Cambridge Analytica in Kenya. And their sister company, SCL Communication, which were led by a British national known as Sabita Raju, who was based here in Kenya, and a familiar name that I'm sure maybe many people in this panel would know of, Alexandra Phillips, who is a former member of the European Parliament and a member of Nigel Farage's party in the UK. And these are the experts who were involved not just in the 2013 elections, but also in the 2017 elections, where I was actually a consultant for the party that won those elections, providing economic analytics. And I did interact with Cambridge Analytica in that respect. And, writing the whole campaign and use of social media, including Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And, the messaging that, was weaved together to make sure that targeted messages have been sent to people. And it was during this time that, the use of Facebook and the expansion of social media has started to permeate in Kenya. So it was very effective, and a lot of fake news and hate messages was characterized this campaign. I have given some of those examples, and what you are seeing on my screen right now was a strategy that was written for the Jubilee Party here in Kenya by Cambridge Analytica and SCL, Strategic Communication Limited, which is a sister company of Cambridge Analytica. And all these were aimed at communicating information that would cause fear-mongering among the electorate. And you can see, this is the handiwork of Cambridge Analytica that was part and parcel of the political campaigns here in Kenya.
Francis, there's an excellent documentary. If you could post a link to that, it was done by BBC4 Panorama about all of this, and it underscores the impact that this had on tribal violence. But just what share of Kenyans have Facebook, and how much, what was that election like to live through?
Yeah, so the Kenyan population right now is about 50 million people, 70% of which are below the age of 30, and most of them have at least primary education. So you have about 75% of Kenyans on Facebook, at least one social media platform. And because of, internet is now cheap, they can access, they have Facebook accounts, they can access material on YouTube, and a lot of that vitriol is currently setting stage for the upcoming elections in 2022. But before them, there is a clamor to change the constitution. President Kenyatta right now is serving his second and last term, but what is occupying the political space here in Kenya is the clamor to change the Kenyan constitution. He has not said expressly that he would want to run for that term, but we have seen this in other countries. In Uganda, Museveni said he's not going to run for a second term, then changed the constitution, and he's now in his sixth term. The same thing happened with Kagame, and it has happened in other African countries. So it will not be surprising to see President Kenyatta running for a third term after the constitution is changed. And the support for to change the constitution, a lot of this information is being canvassed on Facebook, is being canvassed on YouTube channels, and this is handiwork that has been inspired by Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica may not be physical here in Kenya today now, but a lot of their lookalikes are here in Kenya. So we have a lot of quote unquote think tanks that operate like Cambridge Analytica, using tools and inspiration that was that is a handiwork of Cambridge Analytica. So the two ladies that I've mentioned are continue to do the same kind of work. Sabita Raju has been doing a lot of work in India, in Nepal, and has actually been in Kenya since 2017 elections, consulting with political operatives. And I will not be surprised if Sabita Raju will be part and parcel of the 2022 general elections here in Kenya. So Jim, I will post that video on the chat from BBC Panorama that showcases the activities of Cambridge Analytica here in Kenya shortly. I'll post there for any questions.
Great, that's terrific. One more question from me. Just what sanctions, if any, has Cambridge Analytica, SCL, Facebook, or any of these other characters faced in Kenya or elsewhere for this kind of grotesque intervention in the Kenyan election?
So in Kenya, that would be almost none, because the operatives used to work here in Kenya with state protection, and the incumbency here in Kenya are beneficiaries of the activities of Cambridge Analytica. So there is no legal or any, there's no legal consequence that has befallen Cambridge Analytica here in Kenya. They have been called out though by independent media, but then the other challenge is that the incumbency also controls part of the media, and therefore the coverage and the forewarning that the populace needs to get about Cambridge Analytica and their lookalikes has not been as it should be, partly because of the state protection that they've gotten. However, I'm looking at countries like the US that interface with Kenya and inspire democracy in the world, and in efforts to safeguard democratic gains in future and looking into the future of democracy. If I may take you back into the early 1990s, the US was very instrumental in shaping the democratic discourse, not just here in Kenya, but across Africa. It is through the efforts of the US and like-minded institutions like World Bank and IMF that political pluralism was introduced here in Kenya. From one-party rule of KANU to multi-party democracy. In Tanzania, after many years of ujamaa and Ujamaa sort of communism under Julius Nyerere and Ali Hassan Mwinyi, political pluralism was introduced. Likewise in Malawi under Hastings Kamuzu Banda, after many years of autocratic one-party rule, was introduced after efforts from Western institutions and a lot of effort from the U.S. government. Many of us in this panel perhaps would know the story of Smith Hemistone, who was the U.S. ambassador in Kenya in the 1990s, and he wrote a book known as the Rogue Ambassador. And indeed, he was a rogue ambassador because he was a pain in the foot of the powers that be back then, calling out the lack of democratic space here in Kenya. And I see, because this is where we are at now, where we have new autocratic leaders like my current president, who want to change the constitution to extend, their stay in power. We have seen this happening in Uganda. Museveni has been in power for now close to 40 years. Kagame, has also changed the constitution of his country and wants to run for, president for many more terms perpetually. John Magufuli was also in the process of trying to change the Tanzanian constitution, but death caught up with him faster than he could change the constitution, because he was also serving his second and last term, but was also putting in devices to change the constitution. So I see the role of the US, and especially with the new Biden administration, playing the role that they played in the early 1990s of, calling out, number one, calling out rogue autocratic regimes that wants to rule or to be in power in perpetuity. And I think a revisit of that would also inspire young people to call out autocratic leaders who want to stay in power perpetually.
Thank you very much. I'm sure there's a ton of questions for you, but I'm going to ask people to hold those. If they have questions that can't wait, just raise your hand using the application below, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. But that was a very thought-provoking presentation about this issue. Let me turn to Dominic and Gabriel. One is in Cape Town, the other is in Johannesburg. Dominic is at an organization that I've worked with a little bit, AIDC. It's a development organization that does excellent work on mainly helping trade unions in a country that is got a profound history of unions being involved in not only in private gain, but in trying to make the country more just. Gabriel Kraus is in Johannesburg, works with an old institution nominally known as neoliberal, but it is called the Institute for Race Relations, has a long history of really interesting work. So I would try to put you two together. You probably have a lot of interesting conflicts, but let me start with you, Dominic. Lead off on your perspective on this topic of the day, which is the future of democracy, and by the way, what the United States might do to help.
Thanks, Jim. I haven't given much thought to what the US can do to help, but appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts, and I look forward to some healthy debate with Gabriel if there is the opportunity to have that. So I titled the discussion, the interplay between the macroeconomic framework and corruption, and the threat it poses to constitutional democracy in South Africa. So we also have a long history of exploitation and oppression in the country, dating back to, for many years, segregation, land dispossession, ending up in racial segregation and the formalization of apartheid. And in 1994, we had our first elections that was open to all South Africans of voting age. So we are a young democracy, and with that, we had institution of an interim constitution and later the establishment of the current constitution, which is seen as quite a progressive document that enshrines many rights for human rights and socioeconomic rights for its citizens. And at the time of coming into power, the new ANC, the African National Congress, the new government, promised a better life for all. And this was to address decades of this segregation and exclusion of the majority of the country, the majority of Black people. But here we had various forms of categorization leading to, which was so-called African, colored, Indian, and we sometimes put this as a all under the umbrella of being Black, and there's various implications of this. But anyway, so this was a massive potential for redistribution. And at the time, the main macroeconomic document was the Reconstruction and Development Program, which effectively prioritized redistribution. And through redistribution, we would achieve growth. And redistribution would be materialized or manifested through investing in public services, electrification, access to water and provision of water, housing, and so on. This quickly changed though. And in 1996, we see the incoming president who would come in 1998 speak about the need to change the nature or the color of the capitalist class in the country and develop a Black capitalist class. And with this shift in political priority, we also seen a shift in economic priority, where rather than through redistribution, we will achieve growth, and the prioritizing of investing in social investment, social services, and the addressing of massive unemployment and inequalities. We saw the adoption of increasingly neoliberal policies, the deregulation of the capital and exchange accounts through the South African Reserve Bank. We see the increased integration to global trade markets, starting with the integration to GATT and then to the World Trade Organization a little bit later on. And with this, we also see an emphasis on attracting foreign direct investment. Related to this was an inflation targeting regime that crowded out the possibilities for greater levels of public investment, albeit that there was some in the early 90s towards the mid 90s. This quickly started to change. We saw the corporatization and the increase in corporatization of state-owned enterprises, public utilities. And initially, the development of the Black capitalist class was through legitimate means, and the development of policies around affirmative action under the name of Black economic empowerment. And through this, we see a legitimate capitalist, Black capitalist class developing, quite small. But within the political elite, there's increasing impatience among an aspirant bourgeoisie to attain greater levels of wealth and to accumulate at a faster rate. At the time, we see shifts within the African National Congress from the president who came in after Mandela, Nelson Mandela, the first South African president, the one who mentioned previously that we need to develop this black capitalist class, Thabo Mbeki, had a big fight with this guy on the left with the spectacles on, Jacob Zuma, our now former president. And between them, it was a fight about who would control the ANC, and similarly, who would then control, who have control over the state. And so, in spite of the fact that we have a multi-party elections, we have a very dominant party within the African National Congress who have consistently achieved more than 56% of the national vote of those who have voted. President, or the former President Zuma, represented the aspirant parasitic capitalist class within the African National Congress. And with him, there was others. And what we then saw is that this impatience led to a move from the more legitimate means of accumulation through Black economic empowerment and affirmative action to the deployment of various ANC party members to key state positions and positions in various state-owned enterprises or parastatals. And the state was then used as a vehicle for various members of the political class to accumulate wealth in a context where they would have no capital in which to accumulate wealth in the first instance. So this was a way for them to access some form of capital. But it was not only through the state and parastatals, it was also through the contractual processes, being able to tender, so to speak, different procurement projects and initiatives. And in fact, in 2016, a senior procurement officer within the South African Treasury indicated that between 30 and 40% of the South African procurement budget was lost as a result of this private sector public relationship, and sometimes pure instances of fraud, in fact. Around Jacob Zuma, then you have a kind of small business class that has some resources that also is a means for him to accumulate, and also acts, they support each other in a sort of symbiotic relationship where these two brothers, Atul and AJ Gupta, support Jacob Zuma initially through different financial means, and ultimately gets political favors. A lot of this has been documented in recent times, and I've put some snapshots in the screen there of just some of the many troves of what continues to be continued exposés of continued corruption and collusion between the state and the private sector. Here, it's important to note that it's a bit different to the Kenyan context, and it's not as directly influenced in the way Cambridge Analytica, social media and Cambridge Analytica influenced the elections. But here, a PR firm, Bell Pottinger, was notorious for its involvement in spewing racial divisions, and contracted in a sense by this Jacob Zuma Gupta nexus. And this was a means of creating greater discontent and social divisions, and detracting from real socioeconomic and corruption issues that exist in the country. So it's this way that the problem of the social media PR firms and data comes in. The way this threatens democracy and constitutional democracy is, I think that what the trajectory of South Africa's young democracy indicates that as much as voting is important and elections is important, it does not necessitate or necessarily result in a redistribution of wealth and economic policies that ensure the provision of key services to people and for people's needs to be provided for. In the South African context, where there's massive socioeconomic divisions, um, racial tensions, ethnic tensions, and so on are easily played up and create lots of uh, issues in light of democracy, and I'll speak to this in some ways now. So in the first instance, in this context, what we see is the coming together of the Jacob Zuma, who with Bal Pottinger and the Zumas painted a narrative of radical economic transformation. So as a cover for the naked looting of the state. And the idea of radical economic transformation really appealed to lots of people who have been, the majority of people who are excluded from the country. And interestingly, we've seen a meeting between the economic freedom fighters, who's been a party who's massively regressed in recent times, I think, um, to a very narrow nationalist, chauvinistic politics, which can be quite dangerous. And coming together with Jacob Zuma, who's being challenged by the who's challenging the constitution of the country and not attending a commission of inquiry into the allegations made against him and the various acts of corruption. Um, threat is a major threat. Of course, as people may know, South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world as well, um, with massive structural unemployment. More than 40% of the population is unemployed. Majority of them are young, and of those who are unemployed, most of them effectively have never had a job before. So we see a young layer of people, and the majority of them are young as well. A young layer of Black, young working class people, quite discontent, wanting services, wanting houses, wanting jobs, and realizing that the promises that were of a better life for all in 1994 are not being delivered. In response to this, we see one, some of these discontented people resonating with the radical economic transformation crowd, which doesn't represent anything progressive or a redistributive macroeconomic strategy. Instead, it's a rapacious cronyist elite. And then on the other hand, you have a doubling down of a neoliberal austerity agenda, further budget cuts in real terms to education, to healthcare, and to social grants, not to mention various cuts in relation to the public sector wage bill, which will invariably lead to increased levels of retrenchment. So we will see an intensification of disaffection and protests on the ground. And with that, greater militarized response from the state at the same time. So democracy and constitutional democracies are under threat in the form of this cronyist elite, in the form of the current macroeconomic framework that puts immense pressure on the excluded majority of the country. And without a kind of progressive pole of attraction, with the EFF now centering with the radical economic transformation crowd. And to our dismay, some parts of Labour doing similarly. There's no real progressive pole that can take people away from a more narrow, chauvinist, reactionary, identitarian politics. And so these are all big challenges for us in the coming period. Thanks very much for the time, Jim, and for everyone.
That's a terrific presentation, very thought-provoking. Let me turn this over to Gabriel for some comments, and you guys can go back and forth. I suspect you may have more agreement than not, right?
Certainly on the gloomy outlook, I agree entirely. And in terms of the diagnosis, in broad strokes, I agree again. I think that there are maybe some sort of disputes about timing in the history that Dominic laid out really well, which maybe open up a view to a different way of thinking about how we might dig ourselves out of this hole. So one thing is, Dominic quoted Thabo Mbeki as saying we need to create a black capitalist class, but it was Nelson Mandela himself who, even before he became president, turned his back on the socialist and communist policies that the ANC had espoused for much of its for all of its history throughout apartheid. Famously at a speech in Davos in 1992, and there's a good account of what the thinking was behind that, provided by, I think, one of South Africa's great editors, Alistair Sparks, who did the first interview with Mandela and wrote a very celebratory hagiographic piece, and then saw that Mandela wanted to nationalize the mines, and so wrote a very damning piece, and then got a phone call. And his wife picked it up and said, "Oh my word, it's Nelson Mandela. He wants to speak to you." And they went and had a chat, and he thought he was in big trouble, but Mandela came over and said, "Look, it seems that you disagree with me about this macroeconomic issue of nationalization, and I take you seriously. I'd like to know what your reasoning is." And that conversation, as well as others that Mandela had with leaders in the Far East who had gone down a nationalizing route and then came to regret it, informed that pushback. So that's just one bit of timing. And the second bit of timing is Dominic's description of cadre deployment as coming after the Mbeki era, sort of during the Zuma era, this impatient political aspirant class that sees new, rich, black and white people and thinks we want in on the action, it's our turn to eat. And so greedily deploy members of the ruling party into various branches of the civil service and the parastatals, the utilities and so on, where there's a lot of money to be had, and they get in bed with business and do very shady deals. Now that's an accurate description. I just think the timing is off again. The cadre deployment was established in 1997 when Mandela was president. And our current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, was head of the cadre deployment committee since I think 2012 or so. But its attitude had always been to put party loyalists who believed in a certain ideology into positions of influence and power. And so I think we do bear those bitter fruits. I'm just suggesting that maybe they were planted a bit earlier and for overtly ideological reasons. The third thing to notice is that South Africa did experience economic growth of about 5% GDP for almost 5 years. They were the 5 years I was in high school, 2003 to 2007, when Mbeki was president, before Zuma and before the global financial crisis. In that time, unemployment decreased. Millions of people received piped water and housing and electricity. So there was, at the same time, we ran a budget surplus. So there was this sort of neoliberal boogie bear of fiscal austerity, in the sense of taking in more taxes than you're spending, and huge unprecedented in this country's history, then or since, increases in the thickness and the broadness of the social safety net, and decreased unemployment, and a reduction in the sort of wealth gap between black and white. Now, civil society has not managed to keep that up, but it is worth noting that it's worth noting that the redistributive agenda in South Africa faces a major uphill problem, which is that our capital to GDP ratio, or our stock of wealth compared to our income, is extremely low. If you look at Thomas Piketty's data, for example, you'll only find such a low ratio in Europe after both World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II had literally destroyed both supply chains and buildings and murdered millions upon millions of people. That's what it took to get wealth to be so low in Europe. In South Africa, it's been sitting there for quite a while. And so to give a sense of what the ratio is, it's about 2 to 1. So every year we make about half as much wealth as there is overall to redistribute. So redistributing extant wealth doesn't seem like the same kind of thing here as it does in a country like Spain, where the ratio is more like 9 to 1. It seems like growing our way out of it is the only way to go. And in terms of the racial breakdown, things have changed a lot. According to Stats SA, the government's official data producer, as of 2015, which is when the last report was made, subsequent reports were cancelled by defunding. I'm not always into defunding either. The top 10% of South Africa, which is really what's worth looking at because of the huge wealth inequality, is heavily dominated by non-white South Africans. So Black South Africans, defined in this broader sense of Black, Indian, and colored, using today and apartheid's way of breaking things down, takes in absolute terms about 3 times more than the top white percent. And white people overall earn about 33% of national income. So that matters because of the race politics that Dominic was speaking to, and the sort of disconnect between the politics and the reality on the ground. And I worry about that in part. I've just read a wonderful history of South Africa, South Africa's build up to apartheid. Apartheid was an affirmative action program for Afrikaans-speaking whites. And the crazy thing about it, besides its immorality, is that the argument for affirmative action for Afrikaans white people had never been weaker than in 1948. At that stage, only Afrikaans speakers, Afrikaans white people had ruled the country. The civil service had more Afrikaners than ever before, and they were finally outnumbering English whites. In terms of entry to the professions, there'd been great success in Afrikaans lawyers and doctors, and the Afrikaans middle class was burgeoning. So while the white Afrikaner had a good grievance against the English after the concentration camps and the scorched earth of the Boer War, and of course this is what they spoke about long before history, the immediate facts on the ground were that the white Afrikaners were in a better position than they'd ever been to compete in a free market, and likewise Black South Africans were more prepared than ever since to go along on that basis, with leaders like A.B. Xuma, J.B. Marx, of the ANC and like-minded political movements back in the day. So just when the argument for this kind of racial redistribution was at its weakest, or state intervention in order to achieve some demographic outcomes was weakest, that's when it became harshest. And one of our worries is that South Africa's at a similar point where the argument for Black economic empowerment, the argument for redistributing wealth is at its weakest, that this might be the cusp over which we tip into a much harder form of racial oppressive politics in South Africa. I don't think that it'd happen in the next couple of years, but after our talk from Kenya reminded us Ramaphosa would have to change the constitution to stay in power. He could, of course, do that. But short of that, he's likely to be replaced by someone who could usher in, frankly, a new apartheid.
Dominic, any response?
Yes. Firstly, thanks, Gabriel, for being engaging in a convivial way. Yeah. I think that I'll concede some points, and I'll concede that the development of or the idea of advancing a Black capitalist class came before that. But I thought it was quite a telling quote from Mbeki. The second thing I will also concede is that deployment did start before what I'm talking about as a impatient political crony elite. But what I should have said in the presentation, however, was that there is a definite change in the nature and capacity and ability of the people who are being deployed in various ways. So in the first instance, I think you lose many technocrats in very key state-owned institutions. Let's look at SARS, for example. During the times of state capture and corruption, we lose many technocrats, not because of an ideological basis, but because they are either taking up the space of people from the party who should be deployed, the loyalists that you speak about, or because there's a fear that they will snitch on the cronies within those institutions. So, and those who are now, you see also a shift within the ANC itself in terms of the kinds of what they call cadre or cadre. The person who was deployed in 1997 under the Mandela and early Mbeki years were many people who came out of the anti-apartheid struggles. Many of them had some kind of rootedness to the community, some kind of principle about the purpose of being in political office. Yes, some of them wanted to eat, as you say, but it was largely they were the minority by far. I think we can agree. But that changes under the Zuma years, and I think the hollowing out of the state can be seen in relation to this change within the kind of cadre within the party, where now to rise within the ranks of the ANC, it's not because you're a good, capable community person. Rather, it's because you're someone who either kept your head down or helped to feed the hyenas. So that's how you rise in the ranks, and those are the ones who are deployed within the state eventually. And this is how you see. So that's the second point I wanted to say.
We should have, Dominic, I think we should have a whole series between the two of you on South Africa. It's one of my favorite countries in the world, but I've been, struggling with how we bring this back to the topic, which is the future of democracy in your country. And, if you could just briefly both say something about that topic, that would be helpful.
So I think the question of the macroeconomic framework for me is a key one. And I think this is an area where Gabriel and I will have lots of debate. So I think that the liberalization of the South African economy, and Gabriel now speaks of, and by the way, this goes, the neoliberalization, my thesis is the neoliberalization of the economy results in the perpetuation of the exclusion of many people. Gabriel's counter thesis is, well, let's look at under the Mbeki years when the state wasn't this filled with hyenas and there were capable people under a neoliberal macroeconomic model. We had some growth. there was a reduction in inequality between whites and blacks. This is the counter to what I'm saying. Now, when we look at what was behind that growth, a lot of it was related to inflows in foreign direct and for portfolio investment. A lot of that related to either investments in the financial economy or investments in relation to mining and extractivism. I'm not going to get into the detail, it's a separate discussion, but the results of this is increased exploitation, increased extraction of not only natural resources, but also financial resources. And we can talk about that. James knows a lot about it in the form of illicit financial flows, base erosion, and profit shifting. And all of this also entrenches an unemployment crisis in the country. And this is the kind of enabling environment within which you can have this kind of reactionary Trump-like forces rise. This is where the kind of narrow nationalism comes from, when it appeals to the people who are excluded, but the political elites are not interested in addressing those needs. Rather, it's a means of just getting into power as a means to accumulate. And so you can see how this can unravel. And so I think we've seen the limits of a neoliberal financial model. The Financial Times has come out and said, we need a different approach to addressing our economies. And so I think until we can really we stop being unwavering in our dogmatic commitment to some kind of ideological debate, Gabriel, and get real with the facts, that's what we have to do, you know?
Gabriel, are you ready to get real?
I think so.
No, I love how you two debate this because it's fascinating. I'm also aware that Alex Henry is standing by with a great discussion of fake news and all that stuff. So just try to succinctly, are we all on the, I mean, I've been going to South Africa since 1979 and it's one of my favorite places in the world. So we cannot let you, I mean, how concerned should we be and what can we do? Is there anything that?
Yeah, well, no. So I think one thing that everyone can take away is that a centrist like me and a lefty like Dominic both consider this country to be in very, very dire straits, in a very dangerous position. So I think that's one way of thinking that the situation is very serious. I think one way of characterizing South Africa's problem is a disconnect between the will and interests and explicit intentions and desires of most people and that of the political elite, who have captured, not through social media directly, largely through more traditional forms of consensus manufacturing, ideas about wealth redistribution, particularly along racial lines, as being the route out. It's worth noting, Dominic has spoken about sort of what most South Africans think. They've appealed, his thesis in a way is that South Africans have had such a tough time that they see this radical economic transformation platform, which is not very Trumpian. It's about increased taxes, it's about wealth redistribution along racial lines and so on. It's a very statist project. And they think, well, that's the only way that I can get ahead. Anyway, it turns out on the best polling available, that's not the case. So the largest polls were commissioned by ENCA, which is an independent news broadcaster, in 2017. They found that most South Africans and most ANC voters, 80%, did not want radical economic transformation. Our polling at the Institute of Race Relations, which we do every couple of years, also finds that people want much more business-friendly solutions. I look at South Africa's future, and I think that the thing that can't be missed is that the key signature policy of our current president is expropriation without compensation, is an amendment either to the constitution or to existing legislation to allow the government to take people's property without compensating them. Now, even ANC cadres who were deployed across the world to try and get FDI, good or bad as that may be, have said that they can't raise investment abroad or domestically at the rates that they otherwise might be able to get gross fixed capital formation, not the silly stuff, because of the prospect of EWC. Realize EWC and things look very Venezuelan to me, which of course started in a very similar sense. We're going to have EWC for a very small fringe of latifundos, and it'll stop there, and it didn't. I don't think this is a serious ideological worry, but it is something that Americans might consider in their own home. Part of what we do here is also global risk analysis, and we are worried about many things in America, but one of them is the stability of the dollar in the face of budget deficits that seem to a large extent well justified. I think pretty much everyone agrees that 2020 and 2021 are great years to run budget deficits, whether it's along Keynesian lines or whatever. It's a good time to try and fill the gap. But I see serious debates in America coming both on the center and on the left alone, excluding Republicans and whatnot, about whether or not America's overcooking the books for, I think, similar reasons to what South Africa's gearing for, although on a much stronger base. And my risk analysis of America is that America's democracy will survive even if you do stoke a serious inflation and trigger a long recession, because America's institutions are so sound. It often takes an outsider to celebrate you guys, because I think you've been very harsh on yourselves for a few years. But I think your institutions and your capital base are so sound that your democracy and the very important rights that go with that will survive. South Africa is in an entirely different position, partly because, as I said, our capital to wealth ratio is so low, partly, as Dominic has said, because our unemployment is so high. Most people our age and younger have never worked. Yep. And I do believe that what Dominic has said is already the case is not, in terms of people being so poor and desperate that they will go for a status populist because they like the ideas. I don't think that's true yet, but I think give it a few more years at the rate we're going, and it will be the case that most South Africans really will want to eat each other for lunch. And we don't want that to happen, so we do our work every day to try and stop it. And I'm giving you the sad side. We've got lots of happy things to say, but I'll pass it on there.
Thanks very much for that. We have a quick question from Sarah Milburn about this, going to be addressed to you, and then we're going to go to Alex Henry.
Okay, do you want me to give it to you?
Yeah.
This is really to the speakers from Kenya and South Africa about Senator Bradley's theme of campaign financing. So I'm a Francophone in Africa specialist, and in some countries, the party in power has concentrated profits from a country's natural resources, the oil, the gold, minerals, Colombian tantalite, timber, in private hands, usually their own and those of their supporters. And then they've used those funds to finance elections, to influence legislatures, to change voting laws, change their term limits. This has occurred for decades in Chad, which is a country I've studied a lot. How has this gone in Kenya and South Africa? Has this happened with natural resources being concentrated in private hands and used in this way for campaign financing?
Sarah, it is a huge question. I'm gonna instead of polling everybody about it, let me just limit this to Francis, because he probably has a perspective on how that worked. And
yeah, thank you, Jim. I'll be quite fast. And a few weeks ago, we had a session on state capture and crony capitalism. And as much as here in Kenya, we do not have a big extractive sector, I did make a presentation on how we lose over 30% of our annual budget that goes to corruption through shady deals and people who are close to power. I also did give an illustration of how we have a capture and enclosure of whole sectors of the economy. And I gave the example of the current incumbency here in Kenya that controls the small mining sector that we have completely, and also control a huge chunk of the financial services sector by owning one of the largest banks in East Africa, and also controls almost the whole of the dairy sector here in Kenya. And you can draw some correlations between these enormous wealth and campaign financing. And not everybody is able to hire the services of the likes of Cambridge Analytica. And therefore, the answer is yes. We have seen a lot of the state being repurposed for private use, and the proceeds of the pilferage of the country's budget, as well as the enclosure of whole sectors of the economy, being repurposed to keep the incumbency in power, including the current clamor to change the constitution that potentially will allow Uhuru Kenyatta to run for that term.
Great, Francis. Let me leave it at that. And I mean, there's much more to be said about that. We should figure out a way to talk more broadly about